Welcome to Equus Farm Calls, where we take horse owners along with us to discuss important topics on equine health and care with industry experts. Today, we're talking with Dr. Nichola Pusterla about EPM and horses. Equus Farm Calls podcast is brought to you in 2022 by Farnham, the makers of Weight Builder Equine Weight Supplement. Horses with a high caloric demand can be hard to keep weight on. When your horse needs help maintaining weight, incorporating fat into his diet can safely add calories without the risk of digestive upset. Weight Builder Equine Weight Supplement contains 50% fat with no sugar added to help maintain optimal weight and body condition. One daily scoop provides high-fat calories rich in omega-3 fatty acids to promote a healthy skin and glossy coat and deliver a calming energy for performance. Ideal for performance horses, mature horses, underweight horses, and seniors. I'm Kim Brown, the publisher of the Equine Health Network. Dr. Pusterla is a DVM and a PhD, and he's boarded in internal medicine and equine dentistry. He's a professor of equine internal medicine and dentistry at the University of California, Davis School of Veterinary Medicine. His research focus is on equine infectious diseases. Dr. Pusterla also leads the UC Davis Equine Infectious Disease Research Laboratory. Thank you, Dr. Pusterla, for joining us this morning to talk about EPM and horses.
Well, it's exciting. Thanks, Kim, for inviting me to this podcast.
Well, we know that EPM is still out there. It hasn't gone away, and horse owners need to know what they need to watch for. And I just wanted to do a little refresher of what it is and what causes it and how it's diagnosed and how it's treated, just to kind of remind everyone that we are making advances, but it's still there and we need to be on the lookout for it. So, Dr. Pusterla, what is EPM?
Well, it depends how much time you have, but I'm going to try to make this fairly short and not confusing too much. So EPM stands for equine protozoal myeloencephalitis. The disease is actually in that acronym. It affects horses and it's caused by protozoal organisms. And I put this plurals and I'll get back to that. And it causes infection generally of the spinal cord. But these organisms can really invade any part of the central nervous system. And that makes really one of the greatest challenges is because we have a diversity of clinical expression. If we look at the entities that cause EPM, so this started in the early 40s, and the first organism that was actually identified was Sarcocystis neurona. And don't get worried too much about the nomenclature. Know that there are different pathogens, different parasites. So Sarcocystis neurona is a specific parasite for which the definitive host is the Virginian opossum, which means that wherever the Virginian opossum lives, you can expect horses to potentially develop EPM. Now, we know that the spectrum of some of these animals has expanded in the past decades. So, we can blame it on, if we can't blame it on COVID, we're going to blame this one on global warming. I'm just kidding on that one. I'm just being pragmatic, but that's the reality. We always feel like, and I have a lot of colleagues, they talk to me, they live in areas that are relatively cold, and they tell me, well, we don't have EPM because we don't have the opossum. And I always say, well, it's not because you don't see the opossum, that opossums aren't there. So opossums are highly adapted, and they will move in territories where they haven't been seen. So it's not because the disease hasn't been reported that the disease isn't present or the definitive host isn't present. So how does this work? That organism, Sarcocystis neurona, uses the opossum and generally loves new additions, so loves the pups, so loves the offspring of these opossum. And these generally happen in the spring. That's why we generally see, if we look at the seasonality, we see more Sarcocystis neurona sporocysts, so the infectious organism that shed out the feces of opossum in the springtime compared to the wintertime. And a lot of that has to do with the population dynamic. And yet these opossum are more likely to forage and move around during the harder time of the year. So what happened? That organism invades the small intestine of these opossum. It replicates an infectious organism that shed in the feces. And these feces that contain these infectious organisms are then contaminating food, water, pasture, you just name it. And then horses just happen to come along and accidentally ingest this highly resistant infectious organism, and then the cycle to some extent occurs in the host, and it's where it gets a little bit tricky, and there's still some information that we don't know. So I would say that in the US, a lot of horses are becoming into contact with Sarcocystis neurona through contaminated feed and water. When we do studies and we look at antibody response, which is not equal EPM, well understood, it means like what is the percentage of adult horses living in the US that have encountered Sarcocystis neurona, where that organism has developed in certain stages, hasn't, however, invaded the central nervous system. If we look at that percentage, it's very high, somewhere depending on the geographic region, which then parallels to the population of horses and the interaction with opossum, somewhere in the 70%. So that means that, 2 out of 3 horses in the US, if you would take a blood sample and look at antibodies against Sarcocystis neurona, you would find antibodies, which means that they only have been exposed to it, but they haven't developed EPM. So we need to understand that it's 2 different aspects. The percentage of horses that develop EPM is really the tip of the iceberg. There's still many factors that we don't understand. And that's why, science is still trying to find ways to understand what sets a horse apart from another in the risk of developing EPM. We know that there are risk factors. And most of these risk factors are similar to any infectious diseases. I'm just going to use this as a parallel. Okay, so please don't quote me on that. We all know about COVID-19, and it's easy for me to relate to COVID-19 because everybody has heard about it. So every human being has a different susceptibility. Some of these susceptibility depends on many factors. Sometimes it's environment, but there's also a lot of host-specific, so human-specific factors: ethnicity, age, sex, comorbidity. These are the main ones. So if we look at horses, what are these risk factors? And there are risk factors that have been determined. We know that age plays a role. There is no sex bias, so meaning, females and male will be equally infected. There is actually an occupational hazard. We know that performance horses at racetrack, horses that move around are at greater risk. We also know that there's a seasonality to it. If we think about, well, how can I prevent it? Well, you can move outside the territory with this opossum. That's one way. It's probably not practical to board your herd up in Alaska and have to get there twice a day. So that's probably not doable. But, there's certain factors that we can interact with. Seasonality, difficult. Location, difficult. But, aspect of performance, potentially. And then if you think about what is in the performance, it generally relates to stress. So these are horses that are on the road, go to shows, different environment, and there is a level of stress that has, and we know that when we human beings are stressed, we're more likely to become infected. We're more likely to get disease, to infectious diseases, because we're more susceptible. So there's potentially a link, but the whole story hasn't been told yet. There are many research groups that are actually looking at trying to identify, are there any specific factors that are host specific, that are specific to that individual horse, that allow that horse to succumb or become infected and develop EPM. So with this, I start babbling around, and then I forget where we actually started. So we started with EPM and organism. So while I wish we could just stay with Sarcocystis neurona, has its own life cycle, and we associate that with the opossum, there are 2 additional protozoal organisms that make a minority of these EPM cases, but we have to take these into account because it plays a role in the diagnostic, or in the support through immunodiagnostic. One of them is Neospora hughesii. That was discovered in the mid-80s. It has a slightly different life cycle. We know that horses here act as intermediate hosts. They become infected. They will harbor for the rest of their life an encysted form, and then occasionally when they become stressed, immunocompromised, that organism will reactivate, and in very rare instances, I really want to repeat that, in very rare instances, that organism will find its way into the central nervous system, potentially leading to EPM. So Neospora hughesii shares a lot of parallel to Neospora caninum. And I'm saying that because Neospora caninum is a huge contributor towards abortion in cattle. A protozoal organism that leads to a lot of losses in pregnancy. And we know that in cattle, it is transmitted. So it originated, the definitive host is the dog. But beyond the dog, once the organism is present in a female, so in a cow, in a female bovine, then the organism will reactivate during late gestation, and that has a lot to do with shifts in the immunity, and will invade the uteroplacental unit, infecting the fetus. And the fetus can either die, that would cause abortion or stillbirth, or the fetus is born healthy, but now, same as his mom, harbors the organism. And that's what we call vertical transmission, from mom to offspring. And that is perpetuated. And we have actually documented this in horses. We have found horses that were positive, had antibody against Neospora hughesii. As I said, the last name is slightly different, so it's not Neospora caninum, it's Neospora hughesii. But we have found brood mares that year after year after year after year would give birth to healthy foals, never developed EPM, but all these foals had evidence of transplacental infection. They were born with antibodies against the organism before they ingest colostrum. I think I should let you talk, Kim. I'm talking too much. Okay, so that's the second one. The last one that we just recently looked into, it is Toxoplasma gondii. Probably everybody knows more about Toxoplasma gondii than I do. That's the organism where the cat is the definitive host, and it has an effect on human beings, mainly immunocompromised human beings. You probably all heard about pregnant women shouldn't be around cats, or definitely not clean the litter box, because that's the risk. The pregnant woman becomes infected, then there's a risk that that infection may actually infect and get passed to the developing fetus. But if we look at the percentage of Toxoplasma gondii and Neospora hughesii, that's in the single digit. So that's a minority. But it makes it a little bit more challenging, mostly because the diagnosis of EPM, I don't know if you wanted to move towards diagnosis, but this is a disease that has tremendous challenges. And what it is because we cannot identify the organism into the central nervous system, at least not in a living horse, which means that we have to find surrogates of infection. And what we use, instead of looking at the parasite, we look at antibodies. And I said initially, we can look at the blood of many horses, healthy and diseased horses, and then we can determine if they have antibodies. So serological assays are great, because if an animal doesn't have antibodies, so if a horse walks and quacks like it has EPM, it's been going on for several weeks, and you test the blood, or the venereal pulse blood, and the blood sample is submitted to a laboratory, and the blood results come back that there is no evidence of antibodies to any of these three parasites, that invariably almost rules out EPM. That's great. Unfortunately, because of the sheer number of horses that become infected, I said that number is close to 70%. using blood and looking at antibody, even in a horse that has neurological disease, makes it challenging to determine, well, is this the culprit or not? Because I can take the blood of the horse in the next stall of that horse that doesn't have neurological disease, and that horse has the same level of antibodies, which makes it then difficult. This is why the veterinary community, there's been many research done on that, even 2 consensus statements that were written up where a panel of experts has brought up all the literature that is available, research, and the experiences, and drafted a document that gives guidelines. When it comes to the diagnosis, so if an horse owner says, I want to get as close as possible to know, is it EPM or not? We need to have a different biological sample. We need to have what we call cerebrospinal fluid. That's the fluid that surrounds the central nervous system. That's a very privileged compartment. I always say what happens in the CNS stays in the CNS, which means that collecting that fluid sample and analyzing it for antibody truly gives us a reflection of what happens within that specific compartment. Now, unfortunately, the collection of CSF is a little bit more cumbersome. Animal needs to be restrained, animal needs to be sedated. There's different ways to do that. Some of these procedures are done standing, some of these are done recumbent. But beyond just collecting the cerebrospinal fluid for the purposes of determining antibodies, we have to remember that CSF is to the CNS to what blood is to the systemic system, which means that when I collect the blood sample, I may not just look for antibodies. I may run a biochemical panel to look for electrolyte, muscle enzyme, you just name it. I may run a cell blood count to be sure that I'm not missing on anything else. The same would apply to the CSF. That's a biological sample for which we can actually run more than just antibodies. We look at cell content, cell differentiation, we look at protein, and very specific neuromuscular marker or neurological marker for degenerative diseases. So there's more to it. So an owner that says, I just don't want my horse to have that procedure done, remember that that's the most reliable and accurate way to support or rule out a diagnosis of EPM. And even if it's not EPM, it may suggest other neurological diseases. That's really the ultimate biological sample. So that's the way you have to look at CSF, not just, it's just antibody. It's just like, no, it's beyond antibody. It gives a lot of information. That's where we have the challenge. And so, I've come because of the sheer number of horses that do test seropositive. Where there's a lot of confusion is that every horse, and I'll be very sarcastic here, every horse that takes a misstep is labeled as EPM suspect unless proven otherwise. And that's very dangerous. We need to look, or veterinarians do that, they're very aware of that. We need to define the case. So the first step, if you have a horse that is taking that misstep, it's not to just assume it has EPM, convince your veterinarian that a simple blood test is enough, and then the blood test comes back positive, and now you have the dilemma, are you going to spend the money to treat this horse? Your horse may not have EPM. So where really it needs to start is observation. So as an owner, you need to observe. You need to document. Is this progressive? Is this one side, the other side? What are you as an owner noticing? And then you work with your veterinarian. Veterinarian will do a full physical evaluation. Ideally, we'll do 2 additional exams. One is an orthopedic exam. Want to be sure that lameness isn't perceived as neurological disease. And that's where there's a lot of false EPM cases. As I said, the horse is lame. Well, he may look neurologic. And if you test, he may have antibodies, but you can treat him against protozoal organism. If your horse is lame, it's never going to improve. So that's very important. The other test is what we call a neurological exam. It's a series of variable tests that determines how severely affected and where within the entire central nervous system the deficits are coming from. So while we're looking for EPM, remember, this is an infectious disease, and nature is never perfect, luckily. And so diseases, infectious diseases, never cause, or I shouldn't say never because it's biology, I just said it, but rarely cause symmetrical deficit. Symmetrical meaning right and left side equally affected. That's a random effect. Imagine, it's that organism, wherever it ends causing inflammation, it's not going to be bilateral on each side of the brain or each side of the spinal cord. So every time I look and I perform an orthopedic exam and I feel like, okay, this horse isn't lame, this horse truly has neurological deficit, I have to tell myself, where's the origin of this deficit? And is it progressive and is it symmetrical? Because if it's, let's say, acute, it just happened and it's symmetrical, it's very unlikely to be EPM. So I would not even engage in testing it. I would test for other more likely causes for such a presentation because I'm more likely to find a reason rather than find a positive blood sample that now it's like opening a can of worms. Like, what do I do with this? Well, if it was negative, it's great, but likelihood of being negative it's going to be very low. So it's going to be confusing. Now, if the horse on the other side has a progressive, with progressive meaning that you notice it's been going on, has been worsening over the past few weeks, and it's maybe asymmetrical at just one side of the horse, then I would say EPM top differential. Absolutely. You got to think about that. And then, if you rule out others, you could say, I don't really care what the antibody result will be. It really walks and quacks like it has EPM. My veterinarian has ruled out other look-alike. So, I can move on into a treatment trial where you treat the horse and see if there is a response. So that's always an option. But in a perfect world, in an instance like that, you would collect blood, you collect CSF, determine the antibodies, even do ratios of serum to CSF with a quantitative test, so a test that brings a number, and then you will have a result that is meaningful, a result that is supporting or not supporting. And here's the tricky part. Biology again, gray again, okay? So sometimes the result, most of the time, the result will support the clinical impression. Meaning that a horse looks like it has EPM supported by the serum and CSF antibody measurement. Sometimes the horse looks like it has EPM, but the results are kind of borderline. They're not quite at that threshold. And what we need to remember is no diagnostic test is 100% sensitive and specific, meaning that there will be horses that have EPM but the blood work says no. There'll be horses that don't have EPM and the blood work says yes. And so there too, I like the clinical judgment. I like to be critical, objective, and say, hey, you think this horse has EPM? Because as a veterinarian, if I tell myself, well, it's a maybe, it's down number 11 or 12 of my differential, then I'll say probably not. But if I say, hey, you know what? I don't care what the blood results say. I've ruled out everything else. The only player that is still potentially involved with this entity is sarcocysts. And there too, it's not because it's negative to sarcocysts. Maybe it's positive to neospora. Maybe it's positive to toxoplasma. So that's why it's a little bit of a massaging. Getting to a diagnosis requires various steps and requires a lot of patience. Meanwhile, there's no wrongdo in treating an animal. Now, when it comes to treatment, we're fortunate in the equine industry to have 3 labeled drugs. They are FDA-labeled drugs, meaning that they're drugs with the purpose of treating animal with EPM, which means that we have a treatment that we know is working. Now, it works not in every single horse, but it works in the majority of the horses. And the more severely affected the animal is, the more likely we'll see improvement. We'll see improvement in all these horses, but improvement only goes so far. The risk is always that the condition has led to irreversible neurological damage, so damage within the central nervous system, which means that the horse will have to learn to compensate to a certain extent. We shy away from any compounded products, so products that are mixed in a pharmacy, because there's no proof of safety in these products. There's been many instances in the past where products were compounded, mixed to higher levels, and that led to, fatal outcomes. So we truly want to avoid that. We want to use drugs that are labeled for that purpose, that have been validated, safe, with an expected efficacy. So that's really important. Now, how do you interpret the outcome? So the best outcome is horse looks like it has EPM, the immunodiagnostics report it, you treat, horse is getting better. How long do you treat? Well, as long as you see improvement, you continue to treat. The second outcome, it looks like it has EPM, even maybe, it didn't go to the CSF tap, you still believe it's EPM, you treat the horse, absolutely no improvement. You have to look for something else. Every horse is different. But in general, a horse will improve to that specific treatment if it has EPM. It needs to be treated long enough, which, is highly variable. The more severely affected, probably the longer the treatment. But in general, I would say 5 to 6 weeks, even beyond that, as long as there is potential for improvement. And it's sometimes hard as an owner to see dramatic improvement. It's like you and I we look at ourselves in the mirror every day, and guess what? We haven't aged. I haven't aged. I look the same as I looked 30 years ago. I haven't seen myself aging. So what I'm trying to say is that as an owner, if you look at your horse and agonize over it every day, you may not see that marked improvement. So it's very important there too to work closely with your veterinarian, have doc come back after 2, 3, or 4 weeks, reevaluate the horse, do exactly the same test. Then you have a metric, and you can say, no, unfortunately, it's not, there's no improvement. So we have to look for something else. Or you say, boy, I see marked improvement in this horse. So let's finish up the course of the treatment, or maybe expand that course of treatment. So there's this different strategy, and it's where, you got to have the trust in your veterinarian as an owner, and work very closely with your veterinarians trying to find the best possible outcome.
And is there anything that horse owners can do on their properties to prevent their horses from getting EPM, or at least decrease the risk?
Correct. I like what you say is, the way I look at it, it's an occupational hazard. Being a horse in North America, or even it's in all the Americas, and having continuous exposure to scat of opossum is a risk. It's a matter of when and where. Now, how can you reduce the risk? So one is trying to prevent the opossum to get into contact and contaminate feed and water. So I really want to say here, please, please, please do not eliminate the opossum. These animals have a role in the ecosystem. They're a scavenger, they do a lot of good. Okay, so eliminating the opossum, if you eliminate one, another one's going to take its place. You're not resolving the problem. Let them be around, but tell them where to live. So don't let them come into the feed room. Don't let them get in areas where you're feeding the horse on the ground. Be sure that grain and hay is in areas that are protected, or you just, you put a barrier. You prevent a possum from really entering and scavenging. Now, it's always possible that the hay that is bought contains these. That everything is possible, but in general, these are very simple process where you prevent the possum from entering and contaminating feed and water, and you also prevent a possum from entering areas in the barn, or if it's an outside paddock where you're feeding the horse. So these are relatively simple steps. We know that if you have some areas have a greater population of opossum, Other areas have barely any opossum. So that's highly variable. We know that, if there's a wooded area close by, then your opossum are more likely to stay in that wooded area. If you have sometimes, what are they attracted to? They're attracted to food. So if you have a lot of, let's say, other animals, dogs and cats, and you feed them there, you're going to have opossum. You're going to attract these opossums. So be careful where you put that kind of food in areas where there is no risk for horses to become infected. But there's no magic bullet. Now, there is the potential use of metaphylactic treatment, which is treating the horses during risky periods with low doses of some of these approved drugs. Now, these drugs are not approved for the prevention. It's just a twist in their use. And that doesn't apply to every single horse. That really would be restricted to high-risk horses traveling or going to places being immunocompromised where there's a high risk of these horses becoming infected. There are areas in the US where we know, or racetrack or places or event, where we know that every single horse that gets there and stays there for a few days or a few weeks is likely to become infected, are heavily burdened with scallop opossum. So that would be an option. But that's, if you as an owner have or see benefit, then I would say talk to your veterinarian. It's trying to find a protocol that works for you, works for your horse, and is supported by science.
That's a really good tip there. I really appreciate it. And is there anything else that you'd like to add to horse owners about EPM? And I mean, I know that we're still learning things about EPM.
There is a lot, as you said, and that's true. We realize that's true for many infectious diseases. We're very good at the beginning of discovering, or shortly after discovering a disease, to put a lot of time, emphasis into performing research. And then we get kind of I wouldn't say lazy, but we just live with it. We know how to handle it. We're kind of like happy. Sometimes we get frustrated. And it's a shame because, it's considered one of the most common infectious diseases. There's so much more to learn at the level of the host, the horse, the immune system, the way the horse interacts with infection. A lot to learn about, the definitive host, the opossum, and out of these parasites, where they're coming from, what are risk factors. And I want to be sure that, we continue to be vigilant and continue, to support research and continue to enroll in some of these trials just to gain more information. I always say the way we are handling horses today, the event we go, that the platform is changing. If you look at, people travel further these days. It's easy to travel, like to go to multi-week shows. I mean, the whole platform is changing. So with these changes, the epidemiology may change as well. So it's very important that the equestrian community continues to work at determining some of these factors. I'm actually glad there was just a very recent, actually last week, Havemeyer EPM workshop where a large number of research in the field of EPM get together, sponsored by this amazing foundation, Dorothy Havemeyer Foundation, to bring people together, share information, promote collaboration down the road, and hopefully, give that little boost in research, ideas, and needs and directions that we really need for this very specific field.
And that's a great point. And thank you so much, Dr. Pusterla, for joining us today on the Equus Farm Calls podcast. And big thanks to our audience for joining us. And thank you to our sponsor, Farnham, for letting us have these chats. And if you as our audience have any suggestions or comments, you may contact me at kbrown, that's the letter K Brown, at equinenetwork.com. Equus Farm Calls is a production of the Equine Podcast Network, an entity of the Equine Network, LLC.